The courtroom was silent, the tension palpable as 8-year-old Ethan Carter sat on the edge of a wooden bench, his small hands fidgeting nervously. To the world, Samantha and Gregory Holloway were the picture-perfect family eager to adopt him. But Ethan carried a secret, a truth so dark it could unravel their polished facade. What began as a routine adoption hearing was about to expose a chilling web of deception and danger, changing the lives of countless others forever. What was Ethan hiding, and could his brave whisper ignite a fight for justice? Let's find out. Don't forget to subscribe if stories of courage and resilience inspire you. The courtroom was silent, except for the faint ticking of the antique clock mounted on the far wall. 8-year-old Ethan Carter sat on a hard wooden bench, his feet dangling just above the floor. The chair was too big for him, just like the faded sweater he wore, which hung loosely from his small frame. He fidgeted with his hands, his fingers tracing the frayed edges of the cuffs, but his wide brown eyes stayed glued to the judge sitting high above him. The Honorable Judge Marion Fuller was a stern woman with sharp features, but there was a softness in her gaze when she looked at Ethan. She had presided over countless adoption hearings in her career, but something about this boy tugged at her, a mix of fragility and quiet strength that made her lean forward just a little more than usual. To Ethan's right sat Samantha and Gregory Holloway. They were the perfect picture of polished elegance. Samantha, with her sleek blonde hair and pearl necklace, held a warm but composed smile. Gregory, a tall man with salt and pepper hair and a tailored suit, rested a reassuring hand on Ethan's shoulder. "We're so excited to make Ethan part of our family, Your Honor," Samantha said, her voice smooth and practiced. "We've been preparing for this moment for months." Ethan didn't react. He stared down at his shoes, his silence heavy in the air. Judge Fuller glanced at the social worker, Delilah Brown, standing a few feet away. Delilah gave a small, encouraging nod, as if to say, "It's okay, Ethan. Speak your mind." "Ethan," Judge Fuller said gently, her voice cutting through the tension. "This is your hearing. It's important to me that I hear how you feel. Are you excited about being adopted by the Halloways?" Ethan hesitated. The room seemed to grow smaller, the walls pressing in on him. His lips parted slightly, but no words came out. Samantha leaned in closer, her tone syrupy sweet. "You can tell the judge how happy you've been with us, Ethan. Remember how we went to the zoo last month? And all those games we played in the backyard?" Delilah frowned but stayed silent. She could see the boy's hands trembling. Ethan finally looked up, his gaze flickering between the judge and the police officer standing near the door. His small voice broke the silence. "Can I tell you something? Just you?" Judge Fuller's brow furrowed, but she nodded. "Of course. Come closer." Ethan slid off the bench, his sneakers squeaking against the polished floor. His steps were tentative as he approached the bench, the weight of every adult's gaze making his stomach churn. When he reached the judge's desk, he leaned forward, cupping his hands around his mouth. Judge Fuller tilted her head, her ear near his lips. "I don't think they want me," Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible. "I think they want to hurt me." Judge Fuller froze. Her expression didn't betray her shock, but her heart pounded. "What do you mean, Ethan?" she asked softly. "They're not who they say they are," Ethan whispered again, his eyes filled with tears. "Please don't make me go back with them." Judge Fuller straightened in her chair, her face now a mask of professionalism. "Officer Daniels," she said, her voice cutting through the room like a knife. The police officer at the door snapped to attention. "Yes, Your Honor? I need you to escort this child to a secure location immediately, and have Detectives Barnes and Keller meet me in chambers." "What's going on?" Samantha's voice was sharp now, her composure slipping. She stood abruptly, her chair screeching against the floor. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular," Gregory added, his tone indignant. Judge Fuller ignored them. "We'll take a 15-minute recess. Officer Daniels, ensure the child is safe." Ethan clung to Officer Daniels' hand as he was led out of the courtroom. His heart raced, but for the first time in weeks, he felt a small flicker of hope. The safe house was a small, nondescript building on the outskirts of town. To an outsider, it looked like any other brick home with its modest front porch and weathered shutters. Inside, however, was a world designed for protection. reinforced doors, shatterproof windows, and around-the-clock police presence. Ethan sat on a worn couch in the living room, his knees pulled to his chest. "Are you comfortable?" Ms. Delilah Brown asked, her voice as warm as her soft gray cardigan. She perched on the armrest of a nearby chair, trying to meet Ethan's gaze. He nodded, but the truth was, he didn't feel safe. Not yet. Delilah sighed and sat fully in the chair. She had known Ethan for over 2 years, ever since he entered the foster system at 6 years old. She had seen the quiet resilience in him, a strength that shone through the cracks of his fragile demeanor. But today she saw something else. Fear, raw and overwhelming. "Do you want to tell me what happened?" she asked gently. Ethan's fingers tightened around the frayed hem of his sweater. "What if they come for me?" "They won't," Delilah promised, leaning forward. "The police are here to protect you, Ethan. You're safe now." Ethan looked at her, his eyes pooling with doubt. "That's what they told me last time." Delilah frowned. "What do you mean? Last time?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, his gaze wandered to the small, barred window on the far wall. His mind drifted back to the beginning, to the shadows of his life before the Halloways. Ethan had never known his parents. He had been left at a hospital as a newborn, wrapped in a thin blanket with no note and no name. The nurses called him Baby Boy Carter, a placeholder that eventually stuck. The foster homes came next. His first placement was with the kind Mrs. Jensen, who smelled like lavender and read him bedtime stories every night. But Mrs. Jensen was already in her late 70s, and after a year, she retired from fostering. Ethan was moved to the Harrells, a couple who treated him more like an inconvenience than a child. He learned quickly not to ask for seconds at dinner or make too much noise during their TV shows. By the time he turned 6, Ethan had lived in 4 different homes. Each move took a piece of him, leaving him quieter, smaller, and more withdrawn. It wasn't until Delilah became his caseworker that he found a sliver of stability. She was a force of nature, persistent, empathetic, and fiercely protective. She made sure Ethan's new placements were safe, and even visited him outside her scheduled check-ins. "You're stronger than you think," she often told him. Ethan didn't believe her, but he appreciated that she said it anyway. Ethan had been with the Riggs family for almost a year when Delilah called him into her office with news of the Halloways. "They're interested in adopting you," she said, her tone cautious but hopeful. "They've passed all the screenings and background checks. This could be a fresh start, Ethan." He remembered sitting across from her, his legs swinging beneath the chair. "Do they have a big house?" "They do," Delilah replied with a smile. "And they've told me how much they want to give you a loving home." Ethan wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe that someone could love him enough to keep him forever. The Halloways were everything he'd imagined a perfect family would be. Their house was a sprawling mansion with marble floors, a grand staircase, and a backyard big enough to hold a soccer field. Samantha baked cookies on his first day, and Gregory promised to teach him how to fish in the lake behind their property. At first, it felt like a dream, but dreams have a way of turning into nightmares. Ethan first noticed something strange a few weeks after moving in. It was late at night, and he had crept downstairs for a glass of water. The house was dark except for the faint glow coming from Gregory's office. Curious, Ethan peeked through the slightly open door. Inside, Gregory was speaking in hushed tones to a man Ethan didn't recognize. Papers were spread across the desk, and Ethan could just make out the words "shipment" and IDs. The man handed Gregory a thick envelope before leaving through a side door. Ethan didn't understand what he'd seen, but it made his stomach churn. The next day, Samantha found him in the hallway and crouched to his level, her smile too wide, too tight. "Ethan, sweetheart, you know it's important to stay in bed at night, right? Big boys need their sleep." Her tone was sugary, but her eyes were ice. Ethan nodded quickly, feeling a shiver run down his spine. Over time, the Halloways' perfect facade began to crack. Ethan noticed how Gregory's phone calls became more frequent and secretive. He saw men and women coming to the house at odd hours, always leaving with envelopes or packages. One day, while exploring the basement, Ethan stumbled upon a locked door. He had never seen it open before, but something about it felt wrong. The air near it was colder, heavier. A few weeks later, Ethan found the key to the basement door in Samantha's desk drawer. His hands trembled as he turned the lock. Inside, he found stacks of passports, IDs, and photographs. Some of the faces were familiar, children he had seen in news reports about missing foster kids. Ethan's breath hitched. His heart raced as he realized what he was looking at. Footsteps echoed above him. Panicked, he shoved the key back into the lock and bolted upstairs, slipping into his room just as Gregory's shadow crossed the hallway. That night, Ethan lay awake, clutching his pillow. The weight of the secret threatened to crush him. He didn't know whom to tell or if anyone would even believe him. The adoption hearing was his only chance. It was risky, but Ethan knew he couldn't stay silent. Sitting in that courtroom, staring at the judge's kind but curious eyes, he made the decision that would change everything. And now, as he sat in the safe house, recounting his story to Delilah, he felt a mix of relief and terror. "Ethan," Delilah said softly, her voice pulling him back to the present, "what you did today was incredibly brave. You stopped something horrible from continuing." He looked up at her, his eyes brimming with unshed tears. "But what if it's not enough? What if they get away?" Delilah leaned closer, her hands resting gently on his. "They won't. I promise you, Ethan. We'll make sure they don't." Outside, the wind howled, rattling the windows. Ethan shivered, but this time, it wasn't from the cold. The raid began just before dawn. Detective Caleb Harper tightened his grip on his flashlight as he and a team of officers moved toward the sprawling Holloway mansion. The property was quiet except for the crunch of boots on gravel and the faint rustle of leaves in the cold morning air. Harper's pulse quickened. Years of law enforcement had taught him that even the most serene scenes could mask something sinister. "Team Alpha, in position," crackled the voice over his radio. "Copy," Harper whispered. "On my mark." The command came swiftly, and within seconds the police were inside. Samantha Holloway was the first to react, emerging from her bedroom in a silk robe, her face a mask of indignation. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, her voice rising. "We've done nothing wrong." Gregory followed closely behind, his expression calm, but his eyes calculating. "This is a mistake," he said, his hands raised in a show of compliance. "We've always cooperated with the authorities." Harper ignored their protests as he led his team deeper into the house. "Start with the basement," he instructed, his voice firm. The officers moved methodically, their flashlights cutting through the shadows. Gregory's calm demeanor began to crack as they neared the locked basement door. "There's nothing down there," he said, stepping forward. "Just old storage." "Then you won't mind if we take a look," Harper replied. One of the officers produced a key from a ring of evidence collected earlier. The lock clicked open, and the heavy door swung inward. What they found inside chilled even the most seasoned detectives. The basement was more than just a storage area. It was a carefully concealed operation. Stacks of counterfeit passports and identification cards sat neatly organized on metal shelves. Nearby, several laptops and a shredding machine stood ready for use. But the most disturbing discovery was the wall covered with photographs, dozens of faces staring back at them. "These are kids," one officer murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "Foster kids." Harper's jaw tightened as he scanned the faces. Some were marked with red X's, while others had dates scrawled beneath them. "Get these bagged and tagged," Harper ordered, pointing to the evidence. As the team worked, Harper's eyes fell on a small file tucked into the corner of the desk. He flipped it open to find Ethan's name at the top of the page, followed by detailed notes about his movements and background. "They were tracking him," Harper muttered, a chill running down his spine. Back upstairs, the Holloways were separated and placed into custody. Samantha's polished composure crumbled as she was escorted to the squad car. "You're making a mistake!" she screamed, her voice shrill. "We're innocent!" Gregory, however, remained eerily calm. As Harper approached him, Gregory met his gaze with an unsettling smirk. "You think you've won," Gregory said, his tone dripping with condescension. "But you have no idea what you've stepped into." Harper didn't flinch. "We'll see about that." Gregory's smirk widened. Good luck finding the rest. You're already too late. At the station, the investigation ramped up. Detectives worked around the clock, combing through the evidence collected from the mansion. What they uncovered was far worse than anyone had anticipated. The Halloways weren't just running a local operation. They were key players in a sophisticated trafficking network that spanned multiple states. They're using the foster system to target vulnerable kids, Harper explained during a briefing. They pose as philanthropists, adopting children they can exploit, and then move them through the network. The room fell silent as images of missing foster children flashed on the screen. Some of these kids have been missing for years, another detective added grimly. And now we know why. The connection to Ethan became clearer. The Halloways had targeted him because of his quiet nature and history of being overlooked. He was the perfect victim, or so they thought. Meanwhile, Ethan remained in the safe house under tight security. Delilah stayed by his side, doing her best to shield him from the growing media frenzy surrounding the case. They're talking about me, aren't they? Ethan asked one evening, glancing at the muted television screen where reporters stood outside the Halloway mansion. Delilah hesitated before answering. They're talking about what you did, she said gently. How brave you were. Ethan looked down at his hands. What if it's not enough? It is, Delilah said firmly. Ethan, because of you, the police are finding the truth. You stopped them. Despite her reassurances, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling of dread that lingered like a shadow. As the evidence against the Halloways mounted, their high-powered lawyer, Jonathan Reese, launched a counterattack. This is a witch hunt, Reese declared during a press conference. My clients are innocent. The so-called evidence collected from their home is circumstantial at best, and the allegations are based on the word of a troubled child. The narrative was carefully crafted to sow doubt. Public opinion became divided, with some defending the Halloways as victims of a flawed system and others calling for their immediate imprisonment. The strategy was clear: discredit Ethan and muddy the waters. Harper knew the Halloways' legal team would stop at nothing to protect them, but he also knew that the truth was on their side. We need more, Harper told his team, something that ties them directly to the larger network. The break came when they traced one of the passports from the basement to a known trafficker in another state. The trafficker, Victor Kane, was a notorious figure who had eluded capture for years. This could be the connection we've been looking for, Harper said. Back at the safe house, Ethan's mind raced as he tried to recall details from his time with the Halloways. He thought about the visitors, the locked basement, the conversations he wasn't meant to overhear. Then it hit him, a name. Victor, Ethan said suddenly, looking at Delilah. They talked about someone named Victor. I think he was in charge of something big. Delilah's eyes widened. Victor Kane? Ethan nodded, his small hands gripping the edge of the table. They said he was the boss, that he was going to make sure everything ran smoothly. Delilah immediately relayed the information to Harper, who wasted no time connecting the dots. With Ethan's testimony and the growing mountain of evidence, the investigation gained momentum. But Harper knew the stakes were higher than ever. The Halloways' network was vast, and their associates wouldn't go down without a fight. They'll try to silence anyone who gets in their way, Harper warned. His words proved prophetic when a car was spotted idling near the safe house later that night. Inside were two men with ties to the Halloways, both carrying weapons. The men were arrested before they could act, but the message was clear. The Halloways and their network were far from finished. Detective Caleb Harper stood in the brightly lit conference room, his gaze fixed on the digital map projected onto the wall. Red pins marked locations across the country: safe houses, meeting points, and transit hubs linked to the Halloway network. This is bigger than we thought, he said grimly, turning to the assembled team of investigators. The Halloways aren't just players, they're architects. They've built a system to exploit the foster care pipeline, and we need to dismantle it piece by piece. As Harper outlined their next steps, Delilah Brown entered the room, her expression strained but determined. She carried a slim folder, which she handed to Harper. This just came in, she said. Ethan remembered something else. Harper opened the folder and scanned the contents. It was a hand-drawn map, crude but clear, showing the layout of a warehouse Ethan had overheard Gregory mention. In the corner, Ethan had scrawled the words, "Victor's place." "This could be it," Harper said, his voice tightening. The hub. The warehouse was located in an industrial district several hours away, hidden in plain sight among dozens of similar structures. Harper and his team conducted a discreet surveillance operation, watching as trucks came and went at odd hours. "Look at this," one officer said, pointing to a camera feed. A young girl, no older than 10, was being ushered into the building under the cover of darkness. Harper clenched his jaw. "We're moving in tonight." The raid on the warehouse was swift but chaotic. Officers poured into the building, their shouts echoing against the high ceilings. Inside, they found a labyrinth of makeshift rooms filled with frightened children and teens. Victor Kane was nowhere to be found, but his fingerprints were all over the operation. Harper walked through the dimly lit corridors, his flashlight illuminating stacks of fake documents, cash, and discarded clothing. The weight of what he was seeing pressed down on him like a physical force. "Get these kids to safety," he ordered, "and call in every resource we have. This ends now." Back at the safe house, Ethan paced nervously, his small frame dwarfed by the oversized hoodie he wore. He couldn't stop thinking about the Halloways, about Victor Kane, and about the other children who might still be trapped. "They're going to come for me," he said suddenly, looking up at Delilah. "No, they won't," she replied firmly, kneeling in front of him. "We're not going to let that happen." "But what if—" "Ethan," Delilah interrupted, her hands resting gently on his shoulders. "You've already done so much. You're the reason we found that warehouse. You're the reason those kids are safe. And we're going to keep you safe too." Ethan nodded, but his fear didn't dissipate. He couldn't shake the feeling that the Halloways and their network would stop at nothing to silence him. As the evidence against them mounted, Samantha and Gregory Halloway grew increasingly desperate. In their jail cells, they strategized with their lawyer Jonathan Reese, who was already working to discredit the investigation. "You need to stick to the narrative," Reese told them during a meeting. "The boy is unstable. You took him in out of the goodness of your hearts, and now he's fabricating stories because he couldn't adjust." Samantha nodded, her hands trembling slightly. "But what about Victor? If he gets caught, he'll turn on us." "Victor won't get caught," Reese replied confidently. "He's too smart for that." But Gregory wasn't convinced. "You don't know Victor like I do. He'll protect himself first. If that means throwing us under the bus, he'll do it without hesitation." Victor Kane was a ghost, always a step ahead of the authorities, his name whispered in connection to countless crimes, but never tied to solid evidence. Harper's team worked tirelessly to track him down, combing through financial records, intercepted communications, and witness statements. Every lead brought them closer, but also revealed the vast reach of his operation. "This guy isn't just a trafficker," Harper said during a late-night strategy session. "He's the mastermind. If we take him down, the whole network collapses." The closer the investigation got to Victor, the more dangerous things became for Ethan. One night, the safe house was breached. A black SUV sped onto the property, its headlights off, and two masked men jumped out, weapons drawn. The police on duty acted quickly, exchanging gunfire with the intruders. Ethan and Delilah were rushed to a panic room in the basement, where they huddled together as the chaos unfolded above them. "It's going to be okay," Delilah whispered, though her own heart was pounding. The attack was repelled, but the message was clear. Ethan was still a target. In the days following the attack, Ethan's anxiety reached a breaking point. He withdrew further, barely speaking, his small frame curling into itself as if to disappear. But one evening, as Delilah sat with him, he suddenly spoke. "There's something else," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Delilah leaned closer. "What is it, Ethan?" "When I was in the basement," he began, his words halting, "I heard Gregory talking to Victor on the phone. He said they were moving something big. He called it the ledger." Delilah frowned. "The ledger? What is that?" Ethan shook his head. "I don't know, but Gregory said it had everything. Names, places, everything." Delilah's heart raced. "Ethan, do you remember where they said it was?" Ethan closed his eyes, his brow furrowing in concentration. "The lake," he said finally. Gregory said it was at the lake house. Harper and his team wasted no time organizing a search of the Halloways' secluded lake house. The property was remote, surrounded by dense woods, and accessible only by a narrow dirt road. As the team moved in, the air crackled with tension. Inside, they found nothing at first. Just an eerily pristine vacation home with no obvious signs of criminal activity. But Harper's instincts told him to keep digging. "Check the crawl space," he ordered. Sure enough, beneath a loose floorboard, they found a waterproof lockbox. Inside was the ledger Ethan had overheard Gregory mention. The ledger was a treasure trove of information, names, dates, locations, and transactions that mapped out the entire network. It was the key to dismantling the Halloways' operation and bringing Victor Kane to justice. Harper held the book in his hands, a grim smile on his face. "This is it," he said. "This is what we needed." The days following the lake house discovery were a blur of activity. Detectives pored over the ledger, using it to piece together the sprawling network that Victor Kane had orchestrated. For Ethan, however, the world had become smaller, a series of tight, confined spaces meant to keep him safe. He sat in the corner of the safe house living room, his knees tucked under his chin. The television was on, muted, cycling through news coverage of the Halloway case. Every few minutes, a reporter would mention him as the young foster child at the center of the investigation. "They're making you famous, kid," Officer Caleb Harper said, entering the room with a steaming cup of coffee. Ethan glanced at him but said nothing. Harper set his cup on the table and sat across from Ethan. "You know," he began, "when I was your age, I didn't think anyone cared about me either." Ethan looked up, curiosity flickering in his eyes. "You were in foster care?" "Yeah," Harper said with a nod. "Bounced around a lot. I had this one foster dad who used to lock the fridge at night, another who'd take off for days and leave me alone with nothing but a jar of peanut butter." Ethan's eyes widened. "What did you do?" "I survived," Harper said simply. "And eventually I found people who cared, people who saw me for more than just a file on a desk." Ethan stared at him for a long moment. "Did you ever feel scared?" "Every day," Harper admitted. "But you know what I learned? Being scared doesn't mean you're weak. It means you're human. And every time you face that fear, you get a little stronger." Ethan nodded slowly. For the first time in days, he felt a small, flickering sense of hope. While Ethan processed Harper's words, the investigative team was making headway with the ledger. It contained names of traffickers, complicit officials, and even the identities of buyers. But most importantly, it revealed the locations of several hidden warehouses used to hold and transport victims. "This is a gold mine," Harper said during a briefing. "Victor Kane's entire empire is in here." Detective Angela Barnes, one of Harper's most trusted colleagues, frowned. "But he's still out there. If we don't catch him soon, he'll rebuild." "Not if we cut off all his resources first," Harper countered. "We hit every location in this ledger and dismantle the operation piece by piece. Without his network, Victor's just a man." Later that evening, Ethan approached Delilah as she sat reviewing paperwork at the dining table. "I want to help," he said softly. Delilah looked up, surprised. "Ethan, you've already helped so much. You don't have to do anything else." "But I remember things," Ethan insisted. "I heard them talk about places, people. I can help you find them." Delilah hesitated. "Ethan, you've been through enough. It's not your responsibility to—" "It is," Ethan interrupted, his voice firmer than she'd ever heard it. "If I don't, who will?" Delilah saw the determination in his eyes. She nodded. "Okay, but we'll do this together." Over the next week, the police carried out a series of coordinated raids based on the ledger's information. Each operation was met with varying degrees of resistance, but the results were undeniable. In one raid, they freed over 20 children from a makeshift holding facility in an abandoned factory. In another, they recovered piles of forged documents and cash. As the network crumbled, Victor Kane's name began to surface more frequently. His associates, faced with mounting evidence and pressure, started turning on him in exchange for lighter sentences. "He's running out of places to hide," Harper told his team. Victor Kane, however, was not a man to go down quietly. One night, as Ethan sat reading in his room, the light suddenly went out. The safe house plunged into darkness, and a deafening alarm blared. "Get down!" shouted an officer, as the sound of shattering glass echoed through the house. Delilah rushed to Ethan's side, pulling him under the bed just as gunfire erupted outside. The attackers, desperate to recover the ledger or silence Ethan, had stormed the property. Harper arrived moments later, leading a tactical unit to repel the assault. The firefight was brief but intense, leaving 2 of Victor's men dead and the rest in custody. Ethan emerged from the chaos shaken but unharmed. As Delilah hugged him tightly, Harper crouched beside him. "They're getting desperate," Harper said. "That means we're close to ending this." The next morning, Ethan sat at the dining table with Delilah and Harper. A stack of photos lay between them, images of locations, people, and documents tied to the Holloway network. "Do you recognize any of these?" Harper asked. Ethan scanned the photos, his brow furrowed. Finally, he pointed to one. "That's Victor." It was a grainy photo of a man boarding a private jet. Harper's eyes narrowed. "Where was this taken?" "Mexico City," Detective Barnes said, entering the room. "Our sources say he's headed to a compound just outside the city. It's heavily guarded, but if we move fast, we can intercept him before he disappears again." As the team prepared for the operation, Ethan approached Harper. "Are you going to catch him?" Ethan asked. "We will," Harper promised. Ethan hesitated, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. "I wrote this down a long time ago. It's the phone number Gregory used to call Victor. Maybe it helps." Harper took the paper, his expression a mix of admiration and gratitude. "You're a brave kid, Ethan." The jet roared down the runway, slicing through the pre-dawn haze as it ascended into the sky. Victor Kane sat in the leather cabin seat, his face an unreadable mask as he stared out the window. He had evaded capture for years, and this was no different. "Adjust the flight path," he barked at his pilot. "We're not landing in Mexico City anymore. Take me to the secondary location." "Yes, sir," the pilot replied, turning dials and inputting new coordinates. Victor leaned back, confident in his escape. He didn't know that his web was unraveling faster than he could flee. Detective Caleb Harper stood in the bustling command center, a grim expression on his face. A satellite image of Victor's jet was displayed on the large monitor in front of him, showing the plane's current location and trajectory. "He's in the air," Harper said, addressing the room, "but we know his destination. The compound outside Mexico City is our best shot to intercept him. This is where the network ends." "Do we have the go-ahead from the Mexican authorities?" Detective Barnes asked. Harper nodded. "They're sending a joint task force to meet us. Victor won't have time to dig in." Back at the safe house, Ethan sat in the living room, anxiously twirling the hem of his sweater. Delilah sat next to him, her hand resting gently on his back. "They're going to catch him, right?" Ethan asked, his voice small. "Yes," Delilah assured him. "Detective Harper and his team are doing everything they can." "But what if he gets away again?" Ethan pressed. "He's so big, bigger than all of us." Delilah tilted her head to meet his eyes. "Do you know what makes someone brave, Ethan? It's not about being bigger or stronger. It's about standing up for what's right, no matter how scared you are. You've already done that, and because of you, Victor is running out of places to hide." Ethan swallowed hard and nodded. Delilah's words made him feel a little stronger, though the knot in his stomach remained. Victor Kane's compound was a fortress nestled in the dense jungle. High walls surrounded the property, and armed guards patrolled the perimeter. Inside, Victor paced the luxurious living room, his phone pressed to his ear. "We've had setbacks," he admitted to one of his associates on the line. "But the core of the operation is intact. I need time to rebuild." And then, his sentence was cut off by the sound of a distant helicopter. He froze, his sharp eyes narrowing as he walked to the window. The task force was already closing in. The operation began with precision and speed. Helicopters circled overhead, dropping tactical teams onto the compound's roof, while others breached the front gate. Gunfire erupted as Victor's guards fought back, but the task force was well prepared. Detective Harper was on the ground, leading the charge with Detective Barnes at his side. Room by room, Harper shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. We're not letting him slip through. Inside the compound, Victor moved quickly, slipping into a hidden tunnel that led to the jungle. He had prepared for this scenario, but his heart raced as he realized just how close the task force had gotten. The tunnel emerged into a clearing, where a second escape vehicle waited, a sleek black SUV with its engine idling. Victor climbed inside, barking orders at the driver. Go! Now! The SUV sped down the dirt road, but it wasn't long before the roar of an approaching helicopter filled the air. Harper, standing in the open doorway of the aircraft, spotted the vehicle through the trees. There he is! Harper shouted. Take us lower! The helicopter descended, and Harper aimed his weapon at the SUV's tires. With a sharp crack, the shot rang out, and the vehicle skidded to a halt. Victor stumbled out, clutching a briefcase, his face pale but defiant. He raised his hand slowly as Harper and Barnes approached, their weapons trained on him. It's over, Victor, Harper said coldly. You're done. Victor smirked, his arrogance flickering like a dying flame. You think this stops with me? There's always someone else. Not this time, Barnes replied. We've got the ledger, and we've got you. Victor Kane was extradited to the United States under heavy guard, where he faced a slew of charges ranging from human trafficking to fraud. The ledger provided enough evidence to convict not only Victor, but dozens of his associates. For the first time in years, the network was dismantled, and its victims began to find justice. As the news broke, Ethan watched from the safe house. Images of Victor's capture flashed across the screen, and for the first time in weeks, Ethan allowed himself to breathe. He's gone, Ethan whispered, more to himself than anyone else. Delilah smiled, sitting beside him. Yes, Ethan, he's gone because of you. Ethan looked at her, his eyes wide. But what about the other kids, the ones they haven't found yet? They'll keep looking, Delilah promised. And so will I. Ethan nodded, a flicker of determination lighting his face. The danger was over, but the road to healing had just begun. Ethan's bravery had brought down a criminal empire, but it had also taken a toll on him. Delilah worked closely with Harper and other advocates to ensure Ethan's safety and future. The trial of Samantha and Gregory Holloway was one of the most highly publicized cases in recent memory. The courtroom was packed with reporters, activists, and curious onlookers, all eager to witness the unraveling of the once revered couple. Ethan sat with Delilah in a private room, away from the media frenzy. Though he wasn't required to testify, the weight of the case rested heavily on his small shoulders. He could hear the muffled voices from the courtroom through the walls, the measured tones of the lawyers, and the sharp clang of the gavel. The lead prosecutor, Angela Wolfe, was relentless. She painted a chilling picture of the Holloway's actions, using the ledger, testimony from former associates, and evidence from the raids to establish their role in the trafficking ring. This couple, Wolfe said, her voice reverberating through the room, used their wealth and influence to target vulnerable children like Ethan Carter, under the guise of philanthropy. They are not saviors, they are predators. Wolfe walked to the center of the courtroom, holding up a photograph of Ethan. This boy had the courage to speak up when no one else could. Because of him, we uncovered an operation that destroyed countless lives. But the true heroes are the victims who continue to fight for their freedom and dignity, despite what people like the Halloways stole from them. The Halloways' lawyer, Jonathan Reese, took a different approach, attempting to discredit the evidence and paint Ethan as an unreliable witness. This is a child, Reese argued. A child with a history of trauma and instability. The prosecution's entire case hinges on his word and a handful of circumstantial documents. He gestured toward Samantha and Gregory, who sat silently at the defense table. My clients are devoted philanthropists who have spent years helping children in need. This witch hunt has turned their generosity into a crime. Reese's words struck a chord with some, but the weight of the evidence was undeniable. As the trial continued, Ethan couldn't escape the spotlight. News outlets praised his bravery, while critics questioned whether a child could truly understand the gravity of his accusations. Delilah shielded him from the worst of it, keeping him away from television screens and newspapers. But one day, as they sat in the safe house, Ethan broke the silence. "Do you think people hate me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Delilah's heart ached. "No, Ethan. People are angry because they don't want to believe something so horrible could happen. But what you did, speaking up, it saved lives." Ethan nodded, but the doubt lingered. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury reached a unanimous verdict. Samantha and Gregory Holloway were found guilty on multiple counts, including human trafficking, fraud, and child endangerment. When the verdict was read, Samantha broke into tears, while Gregory sat stone-faced, his jaw clenched tightly. The judge sentenced them to life in prison without the possibility of parole, citing the heinous and calculated nature of their crimes. Outside the courthouse, a crowd erupted into cheers as the Halloways were led away in handcuffs. Though Ethan didn't attend the sentencing, Harper visited him later that evening to share the news. "It's over," Harper said, sitting beside Ethan on the couch. "They're going to prison, and they're never getting out." Ethan looked up at him, his eyes wide. "But what about the others, the kids they hurt?" "They're going to get help," Harper promised. "And a lot of that is because of you." Ethan tilted his head. "Because of me?" Harper smiled. "You were brave enough to tell the truth, even when it was hard. You didn't just save yourself, Ethan. You saved so many others." For the first time in weeks, Ethan smiled, a small, hesitant smile, but a smile nonetheless. The conviction of the Halloways sent shockwaves through the foster care system. Investigations were launched nationwide, uncovering similar cases of exploitation and abuse. Delilah worked tirelessly to ensure that Ethan's story led to systemic changes. She collaborated with lawmakers and advocacy groups to create stricter regulations for foster placements and greater accountability for potential adoptive parents. "This can't ever happen again," she said during a meeting with officials. Ethan, meanwhile, began to find his footing again. Though he still struggled with nightmares and anxiety, he started to see glimmers of hope in his new life. One afternoon, Delilah surprised Ethan with a visit to a community center. "I want you to meet someone," she said, leading him into a brightly lit room filled with children playing games and drawing pictures. A woman approached them, her face kind and familiar. "Ethan," Delilah said, "this is Mrs. McAllister. She runs this center for kids who've been through tough times, like you." Mrs. McAllister knelt to Ethan's level. "Hi, Ethan. I've heard so much about you. Would you like to join us?" Ethan hesitated, glancing at Delilah. She gave him an encouraging nod, and he slowly stepped forward. As the afternoon wore on, Ethan began to relax. For the first time in months, he felt like a normal kid again. As the public interest in the Holloway case waned, Ethan's life became quieter. He was placed with a new foster family, the Rileys, a kind couple with no hidden agendas. The Rileys gave Ethan the space he needed to heal, letting him set the pace for their relationship. They never pressed him to talk about his past, but they always listened when he chose to. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table, Ethan looked up and said, "Thank you for taking me in." Mrs. Riley smiled warmly. "We're the lucky ones, Ethan." Ethan's journey was far from over, but he was no longer alone. With Delilah, Harper, and the Rileys by his side, he began to rebuild his life, one step at a time. Ethan woke to the sound of birds chirping outside his window. It was a peaceful morning, the kind he rarely experienced before moving in with the Rileys. For the first time in years, he felt a little lighter, as if the weight of his past wasn't pressing so hard against his chest. The sunlight streamed into his room, casting warm patterns on the walls. He stretched, taking in the quiet moment. There were no locked doors, no muffled voices in the night. Here, he was safe. The Rileys had been careful not to overwhelm Ethan. They took things slow, creating a calm and predictable environment. Mr. Riley, a high school science teacher, always made breakfast and asked Ethan about his day. Mrs. Riley, who worked part-time as a librarian, spent her afternoons reading with him or helping him with schoolwork. Ethan appreciated the small gestures, like how they left the pantry unlocked and made sure he had a nightlight in his room. These little things told him he didn't have to be afraid anymore. One evening, as they sat together playing a board game, Mrs. Riley asked, "Do you feel like this could be home for you, Ethan?" Ethan paused, his fingers hovering over a game piece. He looked around at their smiling faces, at the cozy living room filled with laughter and warmth. "I think so," he said softly. At school, Ethan struggled at first. Other kids asked him questions about the news coverage, about the Halloways, and why he had lived in so many homes. The attention made him feel exposed. But as weeks passed, the questions faded, and Ethan began to settle into a routine. He even made a friend, a quiet boy named Liam who shared his love of drawing. "Do you ever feel like you don't belong?" Ethan asked Liam one day during lunch. "All the time," Liam replied with a shrug. "But that doesn't mean it's true." Ethan thought about that for a long time. Ethan still had nightmares, flashes of the Halloway's house and the terrifying events that followed. He sometimes woke up shaking, his heart racing. But the Rileys were always there to comfort him. "It takes time," Mrs. Riley said one night, sitting on the edge of his bed after a particularly bad dream. "Healing isn't something you have to do alone." Ethan nodded, her words settling in his chest. One afternoon, Delilah visited the Rileys' home. She brought with her a scrapbook filled with letters and drawings from children who had been rescued during the raids on the Halloway's network. "These are for you," Delilah said, handing the book to Ethan. Ethan flipped through the pages, his eyes widening as he read the messages. "Thank you for being brave. You're a hero. Because of you, I'm safe." Tears filled Ethan's eyes. He looked up at Delilah. "I didn't know I helped so many people." "You did," Delilah said with a smile. "And you're still helping. Your story is giving other kids the courage to speak up." Ethan closed the scrapbook, holding it tightly against his chest. "I want to keep helping," he said. With Delilah's encouragement, Ethan began sharing his story at small community events and foster care conferences. At first, he dreaded stepping up to the podium, his palms sweaty and his voice trembling as he faced rows of strangers. He avoided their eyes, staring instead at the microphone in front of him, or the note cards in his hand. His words were halting, and he often felt like turning back. But then, he noticed something that surprised him. People were listening, not just out of politeness, but with genuine attention. Their faces softened as they heard his story, nodding in quiet agreement when he described how it felt to be overlooked, unseen, and unheard. "Sometimes, you feel like no one sees you," Ethan said during one speech, pausing as his voice cracked. He glanced nervously at Delilah, who gave him a small, reassuring nod from the front row. Taking a deep breath, he continued, "But there are people who care, and it's okay to ask for help." Each time he spoke, his confidence grew. The shaky voice became steadier, the nervous pauses less frequent. He began to tell not just his story, but the stories of the kids he had helped to save, weaving them into a message of hope. After one event, a social worker approached him with tears in her eyes. "Your story reminded me why I do this," she said. "Thank you." For the first time, he realized his voice wasn't just a tool for survival. It was a beacon for others who needed to find their own. Over time, Ethan discovered a passion for art. He poured his emotions into his drawings, creating vivid pieces that captured his journey. One day, Harper visited the Rileys to check in on Ethan. As he walked into the living room, he noticed a series of sketches pinned to the wall. "These are amazing," Harper said, pointing to a drawing of a small boy standing in a dark forest, a beam of light shining down on him. "Did you draw this?" Ethan nodded, a shy smile on his face. "You've got talent, kid," Harper said. "Ever think about doing this for a living?" Ethan's eyes lit up. "Maybe," he said. "I think I'd like that." Though Ethan loved the Rileys, he knew he couldn't stay forever. When they approached him about adopting him, Ethan felt torn. He wanted to be part of their family, but he also wanted to explore the world and help other kids like him. "I love it here," Ethan told them one evening, "but I think there's more I need to do." The Rileys supported his decision, promising to always be there for him no matter what. Years later, Ethan stood in front of a packed auditorium, his artwork displayed on the walls around him. He had become an advocate for foster children, using his story and his art to inspire change. As he spoke to the crowd, he thought about the scared little boy he used to be, the boy who whispered a secret to a judge and changed everything. "Sometimes," Ethan said, his voice steady, All it takes is one brave moment to change your life. And when you take that moment, you're not just saving yourself, you're saving others too. The audience erupted into applause, and Ethan smiled. Later that night, long after the applause had faded and the auditorium emptied, Ethan found himself walking along a quiet trail near the Rileys' home. The moonlight spilled over the path, casting soft silver shadows on the ground. The night was cool, the kind of stillness that made everything feel sharper, more alive. In his hand he carried a drawing a young girl had given him earlier, a boy standing in a field of sunlight. Ethan smiled as he studied it again, tracing the crayon lines with his fingers. For so long, he had been the boy searching for light, and now he felt like he had finally found it. He sat on a wooden bench beneath an old oak tree, the breeze rustling its leaves gently above him. Closing his eyes, he let the sounds of the night surround him, the chirping crickets, the distant rustle of a passing animal. Ethan opened his journal, flipping to a blank page. Instead of writing, he sketched. A boy walking through the woods, his path lit by glowing fireflies. For the first time in a long time, Ethan wasn't afraid of the shadows. They were just part of the journey to the light ahead. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing. I put a lot of time into crafting these heartfelt narratives, and your support means the world. Thank you for being part of this journey.